Hey, how's it going? I just recently bought myself one of these. It's the Atomic Amplifier Box, speaker and amp emulation box. And one of the reasons I got this was the idea of being able to use this instead of my amp for doing live gigs, save carrying a bit of weight. And I wanted to see how close this could sound to what I'm using for live gigs. This is my usual amp. I've got a few really nice amps, but this is one that I like to use at gigs. It's the head is made by Hi Guy, Nashville builder. It's the Hi Guy P3, which is based on a modified Fender Bassman type amp. And I run this through this Marshall anniversary, the 30th anniversary cab, which is the closed back, twin front ported Celestion Goldback cabinet. And one of the things I wanted to do was just see how close can you get this modelling pedal with which accepts impulse responses to that actual amp. And one of the best ways of doing that is to actually get impulse responses. One of the reasons I bought this pedal was that you can load your own impulse responses into it. And so I thought it'd be interesting to go through a little bit of how I do an impulse response measurement of this speaker and let you hear what the results are like. So for doing an impulse response of a speaker and amp here, first thing I need is to have my amp and speaker set up. I have a mic here that I'm going to use for doing the measurements. This is my Nuemann U89i. This is one of my favourite mics for using on a speaker cab in the studio. Lovely, warm but still crisp sound. I've also got a few other mics so I can try doing some different things. This is the good old Sennheiser 906, which is another one of my favourite mics. Sounds great on a close mic'd cab. I use this a lot live because it sounds great with the mic right up near the speaker. It gives you that space. And a few other things. Got Earthworks, very nice, clean omnidirectional mics. So a few mics we can try, but for this demonstration I'm just going to use this Neumann. It's the U89. That's plugged into my computer here. And then the next thing I'm going to need is to be able to plug a signal from my computer into the amp. So I have here, for doing that, you're going to need some kind of reamping box. If you plug your computer straight into your input for the amp's not expected to see line level high impedance output, so this just balances the signal. This is one I just made myself, but there are plenty of commercial ones available, or if you're into a bit of electronics, they're quite a simple build. So all we do is plug input output from the box here into the amp, and that's me all set up and ready to go. So for doing the impulse response, I'm using this piece of software called Room EQ Wizard. It's a great wee piece of software. I use it a lot for doing acoustic measurements in rooms, but it works equally well for doing this measurement of the speaker cab. This is a brilliant piece of software, completely free, and does exactly what you need. I think it runs on Mac or Windows. I'm running it into Windows here. And so first of all, we're going to set it up. So I've got my mic plugged into my audio interface and my box here, my amp reamping box plugged into the amp. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got this set up. I have to go to my preferences. I want to check that I've got everything set up right here. I'm running a sample rate of 48 kilohertz because that's the native sample rate of the amplifier box that I've got there, and I've selected all my right inputs and outputs, and I can check the levels here. So if I run a level check, I can see that I'm getting a nice level on here and I'm all ready to go. So very simple. All I do is go up to this measure, hit the measure. I don't need to do a calibration here. I want to measure, I'm measuring from 30 Hertz up to 20 kilohertz, so the full range of this speaker here, and I'll click start measure and it'll make noises. There we go, I've done my measurement. I have all of this information. I can look at the impulse response of the speaker, all that kind of thing. I don't really need any of this information. I'm just going to call that U89i with Hi Guy, because that's my name of it. And then all I do is go up here, File, Export, and export impulse as a wave. This lets me export the this impulse response that I can load in. I'll go 24-bit mono. You have an option on here to go phase minimum version. It just gives you a slightly different tone in the cab. I quite often will export both the phase one and the phase linear version. Doesn't matter too much the technicalities of that. All you need to know is you've got the two of them and you can have a listen and how they sound. So I'll go export and I'll save that here. So once you've done your impulse response in Room EQ Wizard, there's still a few things that you need to do to have it ready to load onto the pedal and to use as an impulse response. So you need to do that in some kind of audio software. I'm using Cubase here, but any other piece of audio or WAV editing software will do. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to import the impulse response I've just made, load it into the project here, and if we zoom right in on that, and I zoom out a little bit, you can see that I've got the impulse response here, but it's in the middle of quite a large WAV file, and I don't want this big a WAV file. I want to get this cropped down nice and small. So I'll start off, just roughly bring this down to size. So one of the most important things is to get the start of your impulse response in the right place, because you don't want to be waiting for a second after you play the note for the impulse response to kick in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag here, looking at the start of my impulse response, zooming right in to sample resolution. I can see where the first sample of the impulse response is. So I'm just going to drag my start right up to there, and that should give me a nice tight beginning. I'm going to then bring that back all the way back to the beginning of my project right here. So that is now all ready to start at 0. Samples is that first thing. The other thing I need is that for the box I'm using here, for the amplifier box, it's looking for a 1000 sample long impulse response. So I'm going to 1000 samples. I'll set my end marker. You'll notice there is a little bit of noise at the end, so I'm just going to add a little fade to that depending on how you do your impulse response. I ran this with the amp running fairly quietly. I'd normally run the amp a little bit louder, but I didn't want to cause too much noise for this demonstration. So there we go. I have my impulse response there. The one other thing I like to do is this is normalized right up to the full scale, so right up to 0 dB. I quite like to bring that down just about 1 decibel, so I'll just go to my mixer here. I'll knock this down to 1 decibel down. That just gives me a little bit more headroom in the processing, make sure I'm not going to get any processing errors or buffer overrun on the pedal. It's not particularly going to bother anybody at all. I need to zoom right in because I've got such a small file now. It's right in there. So that's me. I'm all ready to go. I have my impulse response and I'm just going to do a mix down of that. So I'll do my audio mix down. Once again, I'll just call it the Hi-Guy U89 impulse response. It's a WAV file. I'm saving it at 48K, 24-bit, and a mono down mix. So I will just select that and export the audio. There we go, that's exported and I have an impulse response all ready to load onto my pedal or onto any other modelling software or other pedal. So something that's very easy to do with your setup for a mic and an amp. You can make your own impulse response measurements here. You can try doing all sorts of things like trying different mic positions. I tend to just mic up in the place that I've regularly mic'd up this cabinet for doing studio recordings. I can try lots of different mics. I also like to try doing different volumes on the amps because one of the problems with the differences between impulse response modelling and an actual amp is that sometimes, you know, the tone and the impulse response of both the speaker and the amplifier will change depending on how loudly you're playing. So you might want to use, when you're trying to model the amp running nice and clean with very little distortion, it might be good to use the impulse response from a similar kind of measurement when you've got it cranked up, really driving the valves hard and driving the speaker hard. That actually changes the way that the speaker responds, and so you can get a slightly different tone. So it's quite nice. Quite often I've been making a lot of measurements with a low, a medium and a high volume, and that just gives me a slightly different tone. Tend to find when I'm driving it a little bit harder I get a slightly thicker, warmer tone, and when it's a bit quieter, well, it's a bit cleaner and crisper, just like you'd kind of expect from how your tone of your amp works. So that's how to do an impulse response, and let's have a wee listen to the difference and how they sound. So how do we get on? Well, I've loaded the impulse response onto my wee pedal down here, and I have split the signal coming out of my guitar so I can record both the input from the microphone on the cab and also the direct signal from the amplifier box, and let's see how we get on. Can't always expect it to be exactly the same. Obviously the amplifier box is currently running a model, the Fender Bassman model on the amplifier box is the amp model, which is obviously similar to the amp here, but not exactly the same. So it's probably not going to be exactly the same, but let's have a wee go, see how we get on. I shall play a little bit, have a listen, and we'll see where we are at the end. So I always think the hardest thing for amp modelling is getting that tone on that kind of amp just beginning to break up. I think a lot of amp modelling, since even the early pod days, has been quite good on the heavily distorted stuff, but it's always that kind of clean just on the edge of breaking up that I love playing with, and it's quite nice to hear. I think this pedal's doing really quite well. Obviously I have a lot of EQing and I can play with the gains and stuff on the pedal itself to get maybe a little closer to that tone, but I would say it's a pretty good success. I think I've got the sound distinctly similar, and I think at a live gig I could get away with just using the amplifier box if I didn't want to carry my big amp here, although I still love the sound of the amp. The amp sounds really nice, and there's something about the interactivity and the playability of a really nice valve amp, which I still think you're a little bit short of on the atomic pedals and most of the other modelling pedals, but they're awfully much getting closer. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please do feel free to leave any comments and ask any questions if you'd like to, and yeah, good luck with your amp modelling. Thanks very much.